Welcome to Immersive React, where we're teaching you React concepts in 10 minutes or less. This is Lesson 101 on components and containers. Check out the lesson description page to make sure you've installed the necessary prerequisites, which include Node, NPM, Yarn, Create React App, and Visual Studio Code. So let's open up VS Code and go to the terminal window. Type Create React App Lesson 101 and hit Enter. This will create a basic application to get started with. These lessons will move quickly, so if you want to follow along, just pause the video anytime to catch up. Now that our app has been created, type cd lesson 101, then yarn start. Our React app will open in a browser and we're ready to begin coding. Let's open the root folder in VS Code and take a look at the files and folders that were generated. In the public folder, there's the file index.html. This is the file that gets served up when the browser automatically opens. In the source folder, there's index.js, which is the entry point for the application. This tells React where to render the root component on the page. app.js is the main component that is rendered. Right now it's showing the Welcome to React header with a spinning logo and some content underneath it. We're going to edit the contents of this file. So let's copy all of app.js and paste it into a new file named row.js. This will be our first component. We'll paste in the content and trim it down to just what's needed. We'll rename the component to match the file name and we'll put in some text for now. Now that we have our component, let's open up app.js and import it so that we can show it. We'll replace the paragraph part and put our component there instead. When we save, the browser reloads a page so we can see our changes. Let's flesh out our row component. We're going to put everything inside of this root div element. We'll create two columns side by side. The first one will hold the radio button, and the second one will be for the caption and the description. Next, we'll add some styling to these columns so they line up correctly. To set style on an element in React, we use an attribute named style and assign it the variable surrounded by curly braces. Now let's make the caption have a bold font. And finally, let's make row have some border and spacing. We're giving it a background color, a border color, and radius, aligning the text left, and then some margin, padding, and a fixed width. Let's talk about our component in more detail. React uses a syntax called JSX that looks and works almost exactly like normal HTML. It's important to note the nesting levels. All of our components' content is contained within a single top-level element. In the latest release of React, however, you can now return an array of elements to be rendered rather than having only a top-level element. In HTML, you use the class attribute for CSS, but in JSX you use class name, which is what regular JavaScript uses. To use dynamic variables in JSX, we use single curly braces. Let's turn the caption and description fields into variables instead. Inline style is another concept that's commonly done in React. The syntax is very CSS-like, but it has a few dissimilarities. It uses camel casing instead of hyphens, and instead of separating rules with semicolons, it looks like a regular JavaScript object. Pseudo-selectors like hover and media queries won't work without the use of an external library. An alternative to doing styling this way is to use an external CSS file and import it. This decision depends on personal preference. An important thing to note is any CSS file imported into a component is just like adding the style sheet to a page. It will affect all elements on the page that have a matching class name. Let's talk about container components and how they differ from regular components. Think of a regular component as something displayed on the screen that the user can interact with but has data passed to it. A container component holds at least one regular component and is responsible for retrieving and storing data. Let's create a new file in source named rowcontainer.js and paste in a copy of the code from row. Open app.js and update it to show row container instead of row. And in row container, we'll import the row component. From here, we'll pass caption and description to the component as properties, or props for short. Open the row component and change the variables to use props instead by specifying this.props.caption. Now that we have that working, let's make a few more rows with some real data. We'll make an array named options and add 2 new rows so that the user can select an option out of a set of radio buttons. To show an array of row components, let's use the map method to loop over the array and return a row for each entry. We'll move the row component into the map method and change the variables accordingly. At this point, our screen is showing our array of options. However, if we open the inspector, we see a warning from React about needing a key. Let's go back to our map method and get the loop index. We'll pass that as the key property to each component to satisfy the warning, as well as removing the unused variables. Let's add more styling to our row component so that the selected option is more obvious to the user. We'll use the spread operator to copy the row style variable, and let's override the border and background. Let's test this out by setting the row style to the new variable. Now we need to conditionally set the style of the row using an if check. To do that, we're going to use component state. This is done by creating a class level variable named state and assigning it to an object with our default values. State variables are useful when we need to track something that changes within our component. To read this variable in our render method, we'll set a variable to the value of this.state.isSelected. Let's also add our if check to set which style variable we use for the row, and we'll also use destructuring to be a little more modern. We're now ready to make our first event. We'll make it so that clicking a radio button will make the option selected. Let's create the event handler first, named handleClick. Notice that we're using a fat arrow function so that we can keep the context of this. Inside the function, we'll call this.setState and pass an updated object. Now, for the radio button, we'll add a name property, a checked property set to our isSelected variable, and an onClick property set to this.handleClick. The radio buttons behave properly, however the row styling doesn't get reset when a new option is selected. We'll solve that shortly, but for now let's make our render function cleaner. We'll move the if check to its own function named getRowStyle. There's no need to put this function inside the class as it has no dependencies on any variables inside of it. Let's add a third option to our array. And while we're doing that, let's talk about UI updates in React. We use state in our row component to handle UI changes, but it only applied to that instance and not to the others. That's because component state is only known to its own instance. React will only update the UI for a component if its state changes, or if the props being passed to it changes. Just like we did for the component, we'll create a state class variable in the container. We'll set the options array here so that we can make changes when one of them is selected. Let's create an event handler in the container named handleOptionClick. We'll give it a parameter of the index of the option that's clicked. In it, we'll use the map method on our array and return a copy of it with the changes we care about. For each option, we want to set isSelected to either true or false depending on the clicked index. Then we need to call this.setState and pass in our modified object. Calling this.setState will not modify the original array. Instead, it creates a new object and assigns it to state. This is known as immutability and is one of the key principles of React. Now that we have our event handler, let's pass the isSelected property to the row component. We'll also pass the event handler function as well. We'll need to bind the index variable so that it's automatically passed to our function when the event is triggered. Bind will take 2 parameters here. The first is the object returned to by this. The second is the index property we specified when we wrote the function. Let's go back into the row component and replace our local event handler code with this.props.onClick and set isSelected to this.props.isSelected. Now when we click between the options, only one of them will appear selected. React is showing a warning here about using the checked property. Let's update the radio button to use default checked instead to satisfy the warning. This concludes Lesson 101. Check back on immersivereact.com for more content and sign up for our mailing list so you can get notified when we release new videos. And thanks for watching.